This is a Lander and Rogers podcast, bringing you fresh perspectives on the legal and business landscape and life through a legal lens.
Welcome to Legal Human, a podcast focused on the role of human lawyers in the legal ecosystem and society more broadly. I'm your host, Anthony Kearns. Very pleased to welcome Kirsty Harvison, General Counsel and Head of Advisory for Your Call and Rely. But you've spent the bulk of your career as an in-house lawyer and a large portion of it as General Counsel.
Yep.
Reflecting across those sorts of various contexts in which you've worked as an in-house lawyer and then as General Counsel, what are your reflections on the relationship between legal and the human system, the legal function and you and your role and those sort of human systems around you? How would you describe the complexity and what's interesting about that interface between those things?
Big question, Anthony. So I started my career in a law firm, as a lawyer and then a senior associate, and I really moved into in-house. It wasn't actually a deliberate choice. It was more a circumstance, really. I had one child, and then very quickly had another one, 2 in 2 years. And I was in a big law firm, and at the time, although they had all the policies around parental leave, which I greatly received, the structures weren't quite there to give me the flexibility that I needed at that time. So I just looked for a role that did, and it was actually an in-house role. And it was a general counsel role at that time, but in a smaller organisation that I ended up staying with for 8 years, and in that time the role and the business really grew. So my reflection on there is that I think what I started out to do as a lawyer and what I thought being a lawyer was, which is having a very narrow skill set of expertise, providing advice and solving a specific problem, really changed when I went into a business, because we're in the business looking at their problems. And I think it's quite a mindset shift too, to be in the practice of law in a law firm where everyone else is a lawyer and you are surrounded by like-minded people and you understand, what your job is and what success looks like, to then going in-house and being with a really diverse group of people, different pace, lots of competing demands, and trying to sort of prioritize those demands and influence people that think differently from you, and trying to work out actually, what is my purpose here and what does success look like? In the law firm, you kind of know what your purpose is. You're given some, a piece of advice, advise on something. Success looks like happy client and good billables. In-house, it was quite different.
Have you seen those expectations evolve over your time in-house?
Yes. And I also think part of the evolution is the evolution of myself and growing in the role and seeing, viewing the role differently because of my own experience, expertise, real kind of journey of self-development, more professional studies. I don't know if it's what the business is wanting from lawyers or it's what lawyers see that they can do that's changing. And I think it's really different depending on which organisation you're in as well and what is your operating environment. I've worked across businesses in industrial environments, in hospitality, in logistics. They're all quite different needs, and now in a software environment.
And where you felt you've been most successful?
Yeah.
How do you define that, and what do you see as the enablers of that? What are the key things that need to be in place at the interface to make that work?
Trust and influence. And it took me, trust and influence. And I think it took a while to kind of work out what that is. How do you get trust? How do you get influence? Again, when we're young lawyers in a law firm or even in a law firm, certainly in those junior roles, you're sitting there. Your role is really to research the law and write the advice and get that out. But then when you're in more senior in those roles, and then certainly when you're in a business, that is not enough. to actually influence decision making, you've got to build these trusted relationships. How do you go about that? There's, I think, a very, very big piece in listening rather than advocating that we never learnt. And that to me is, I think that's the big, big shift that I've really learnt in myself is holding back. There's this temptation that we, not doing it now, but, there is this temptation to jump in and tell them the answer, or at least let everyone know that you are the smart person with the law degree. That we've got, you talk about, Anthony, these attachments, one of the attachments to being right, that resonates really strongly. We've gotten to the positions that we are in because we've studied really hard at school. We got the big fat marks in the final. We got through law school, a very competitive environment to get the good grades, to get into the big law firms. And then, so it's been for a lot of us, a lot of competition rather than collaboration, and a lot of being attached to knowing and being an authority, which serves you to a point. But if you're really wanting to get good trust and engagement, you've got to do more than tell people the answers. You've got to listen deeply so that you are hearing and learning more about what is the real problem, what is the thing that they're trying to solve. I will add too, just on in-house, I think the one of the great things in-house that we often forget is that we have a unique view across the organisation that other people just don't. So we will see, property development and marketing, they're not talking to each other, but legal knows what's happening in both those streams. So when you ask the question about the evolving role of lawyers along the way, I think that's really a big one. Every business I have been in, doesn't matter what size they are, has silos. And every business that talk about breaking down the silos, they never do. But lawyers are in the middle. They're often seeing them and are able to connect the dots in a way that other businesses can't, or business units can't or don't. And I think that's part of the evolving role in-house as well, is that, just that connection.
So, when you first came out of a law firm into an in-house role, it sounds like there was a really steep learning curve. And some of that must have seemed quite disorientating. Like, you're telling me that I'm now measured by different things. And the other thing I'm hearing is that you came to realise that you're measured by your impact, not on the quality of your output. So it's, have I achieved change? Have I influenced something?
Yeah.
It's also how you measured. You're not measured because you were right. Whether you're not, you're right. It's not binary. You're measured on, did the organisation become more compliant, better in some way? Is that fair?
Yeah.
And you're also talking about curiosity and inquiry. Because presumably that has to be first informed by interest. You have to be interested in things beyond the legal component. How did you realise that was something you needed to be curious about? Were there any pivotal moments where you just sort of sat back and went, I'm paying attention to the wrong things here?
What a gorgeous question. I don't, on the spot, I can't think of there being any pivotal moments where that, again, I think it was just evolving. And it's probably part of that conscientiousness that we know lawyers are high in conscientiousness. Part of that is, how do we do this better? Whatever that looked like. How can I add more value? How could I be more service? And also, how can you make your job as interesting and dynamic as possible? And part of that was that curiosity around seeking to understand the business better and what it was trying to do. I will say the flip side of that, though, is taking on too much responsibility, and feeling that, you're the person that's in the middle that's going to be the saviour, or is the only one that can steer the business where it needs to go. So there's a flip side there. But your question, I think, was when did you notice paying attention to the wrong things?
Because I get the sense you sort of fell into in-house, right? It was a
Definitely.
choice made,
Yeah.
not on your interest in being an in-house lawyer, it was on other factors.
Yeah.
And you found yourself in this really different context, measured by different things.
Yeah.
Was there a mentor or a person that helped you realise that there's a different priority here?
In my very first in-house role, it's actually the head of development. Shout out to Rob Whitwell, who he's an engineer. He and it was a property development enterprise, and he got me really interested in the business and how the business makes decisions. And so, but I was at the start looking at definitely through the lens of, I'm a lawyer, I've got to get these legal agreements right, but then looking at that broader, just the broader context in which we were operating and trying to think a few steps ahead around where the business was going, what did the future look like. So it was those things, just engaging more broadly with, in the business and being in the business meetings that were not just legal related things, but there were broader commercial, those commercial decisions.
Now, at the risk of editorialising, it sounds like the way you're describing is you then evolved to look at sort of human needs in the situation. So what's important to this person may diverge to some extent from what's important to the organisation. So in one of my roles early on, really significant joint venture where joint venture parties were not always, funnily enough, seeing eye to eye. So that really, so when you talk about curiosity, that really started me thinking about what are people's motivations here, what are their drivers, how can you, perspective taking, I guess, but a bit of how can you also try and see things through their lens rather than holding very tightly to what I thought was where things needed to go. So that was probably the start of that process around. As the origin of that rigidity, the belief that you're right, and did you lose the tightness of connection?
Yeah, not immediately, but yes, it's definitely, I think this idea of intellectual humility, we all like to think we're intellectual, we've got intellectual humility, but often we don't, but really, really trying to just hold on to that idea of rightness more lightly early on and seeing my role more around influence, letting the business, understanding where the business wanted to go, but then framing it around the parameters where it needed to be. So making sure that it was obviously in what it's legally allowed to do.
If you reflect back, right, to when you're in the law firm and you had these sort of quite clear measures of success that were quite technical, legal, output related, did you feel were you interested in humans at that point and you were contained by that culture, or is this been unlocked was this a revelation for you personally when you came into this?
I became much more interested in humans as I became more developed in my career and I was in business, definitely. And I think, whether this is part of adult development or it's actually from experience around coming to know myself more, possibly, but certainly my interest in well-being. I mean, when I'm talking about that, I mean around creating sustainable practices where people can thrive. That absolutely happened later, and it happened through, I think, being in these leadership roles and seeing a lot of people not thriving. And so then, certainly that deep interest in that happened later, but it was really through stepping outside of myself and developing some more empathy, and that deliberate shift from being really focused on competition to more actually on working better with others and creating an environment that I wanted to be in, that other people could also function well in.
Knowing you only in that second part of
I
find that quite surprising that wasn't that there was a non-empathetic version of Kirsty Harvison at some point that
Look, to give an anecdote, I mean, my first child, I don't know if you know this already, but I went into labour at work. My waters broke at my desk. And to me, I look back now and think, how on earth did that happen? That's a really good symbol of how disconnected I was with my own body and self, so kind of driven, but just in the head, not an embodied way. Yeah.
Have you, that connection with self or knowing of self was did that come before your curiosity in human systems, or are they sort of, you can't delineate it like that, you can't divide it like that? Was that necessary for you to find?
Oh, I don't know. I mean,
temporally.
It's hard to spot these things in reverse, right?
Yeah. So you've become so interested in this, you've studied it, right?
Yeah. Yes.
So you didn't go off and do an LLM, you chose a different academic path.
Yep.
Tell me about that.
Yeah. So, I didn't do an LLM. I did a Master's in Applied Positive Psychology a couple of years ago. And my motivation for that was very much around how do you create high-performance workplace cultures. It was really around increasingly I was asked to do more around the people side of things, but I always felt like I didn't have good frameworks around it to really lead that effectively. And I was just deeply, deeply interested in we spend so much of our time at work. How do you create workplaces where people can do their best work? So I did that Master's, and it was transformative, is fair to say. I mean, there are lots of things in there that you sort of think are common sense, but there was lots of other things in there where I just thought, wow, this is the piece of knowledge that I have been missing for a long time. But so that was very much, and as I see myself now, it is much more around very interested in the human systems and the role of context. How we show up is very much dependent on the systems that we're in and who's around us and how they're operating. And I don't think, it sounds obvious when you say it, I mean, of course, but I don't think I really appreciated that until relatively recently.
And the systems you bring in, life experience and
the
way you've been shaped. And all that.
Yep, of course.
So how do you apply that? Master of Applied Positive Psychology. So what, are you running programs, courses? How does it show up in your continuing practice as a lawyer? How is it? A lot of people would say, I can't see how that could be relevant to what I do as a lawyer.
I think, lawyers, we tell ourselves we're sort of selling people law, but, we're really selling comfort and security. We are all relational beings, but lawyers it's a relational practice. It's a relationship-based practice. So how, we show up in that really affects the service that we provide to our clients. It certainly affects our teams. It's having an awareness of the boundaries that you can apply to yourself, your own thinking patterns, the way in which how you speak or listen or attend to people, how it then impacts what they will appear with, your own emotional regulation. I think that's a huge one for all of lawyers, particularly with our attachment to being right and our discomfort with big emotions. That I know you talk about that too, Anthony, but that was a huge one for me as well. Lawyers, we're told to be rational and emotions have no place in the law. But of course, I've learned that, we're not rational beings who sometimes feel. We're emotional beings who sometimes think. It's quite a shift. But lawyers, we're attached to that rationality. So, how does it show up? It shows up in lots of ways around that awareness, but also actually getting much more comfortable with the idea of emotions and the role of reflection and, those preventative strategies to stop burnout, but also recognising those behaviours in the people around you so that you can support them better to perform well.
I love the way you describe that as, emotional beings that sometimes think. I'm going to push you, right? Because I think there's going to be people listening who, for example, just finished their law degree going, how on earth, with what I've just been told a lawyer is.
Mm.
How on earth is all of this in any way relevant and useful? And the other thing I wanted to pick up on was you talk about emotional regulation, and then you go straight into talking about increasing our tolerance for strong emotions, our ability to work with emotional data. So when you say emotional regulation, you're not saying suppression.
No.
What do you mean by emotional regulation if it's not suppression?
I definitely don't mean suppression.
Or entirely suppression. I mean, we need suppression from time to time, but
a big piece for me, regulation, is actually that recognition. Like going into, or just before this recording, I was on a call that was fairly, it had some consequences attached to it. And just knowing, I could feel myself become heightened. I could feel my heart racing. I could feel my cheeks get a bit red, and just knowing that is the physiological, emotional response to a conversation that I found had some sort of threat and consequence in it. And just knowing that, so that then the regulation piece is then having a bit of a pause and taking a few deep breaths before then considering the next step. That's what I'm talking about when I say regulation. It's not pretending it never happened and then going on, because at some point that emotion is going to come out somewhere. It's actually being able to notice it and pay attention to it. In the same way that all of us have had a board member or a client or a senior partner perhaps speak to us in a way that it didn't feel great. It's, well, how do you sit with that and recognize the impact it's had on you without it destroying you? Also launching into a response that may not be the best response in the longer term.
Interestingly, you see this as key to effectiveness. And in fact, you were just describing a situation that I was witnessing where you came in and you realised that you weren't ready for this. But you went into a deliberate practice to prepare. I mean, that seems pretty useful as a practice, particularly if you're in a high-stakes role like a general counsel and you may be going from one stressful meeting to another.
Yeah.
You've got to move from a stressful meeting into a really tough conversation with one of your team about their well-being. How do you switch gears?
Yeah. And when you're talking about a practice here, like, to be clear, it was probably 90 seconds.
Yeah.
Like, we're not talking huge amounts of time. Something I want to circle back onto was you said something about young lawyers or people who are studying now and come out, and what's it mean for them for practice. I did do my law degree last century, so I appreciate it's a while ago. But the thing I was reflecting on when you asked that was, I don't think we ever did any work where we were talking about this stuff, where we were actually thinking about what it means to be a lawyer in practice. I don't remember ever having any kind of dialogue around client needs, trust, building relationships. It was all around, this is the law, this is the problem, write an essay how you solve it. I don't know if the study of law has evolved since then, but if young lawyers are still predominantly, that's still the model, then there is a huge gap.
Yeah, which sort of brings us to that's really the stimulus for this podcast, and it brings us to this question I was wanting to pose to you, which is, we hear so much in the profession about the impact, positive and negative, of enabling technology, particularly generative AI. And it does seem that what you've just described as an educational experience seems to be preparing people for exactly what AI's promised to do. Now, I imagine that makes people feel, concerned, worried, anxious about, to what extent is being a lawyer going to be constricted or changed or available to me? What is the work I will be doing? So in your mind, or if you think about the evolving role of a lawyer that's truly technology enabled, let's assume for the purpose of the exercise, we get to the point where generative AI can do a lot of those things we're doing and better than us. We're no longer the best vessel for the accumulation and regurgitation of of knowledge.
Yeah, we'd be naive to think that that's not just around the corner. So none of us are going to have jobs. But that piece around, we know that AI is, at the moment it's trained on very general material, so it hallucinates a lot, it comes up with the wrong stuff, but we know it's going to get very sophisticated very quickly when it's trained on more complex legal information. We know that. What our jobs will look like in the future, I think it's obviously hard to predict. And I just look back to the last 18 months. ChatGPT, everyone's using it now. It was only 18 months ago that it even arrived. And I know that because I was having Christmas before last. One of the companies I work with now is a software company. So I was at Christmas lunch sitting next to one of the software engineers. And I had read about ChatGPT on LinkedIn or something. And so I asked this software engineer, Dom, what can you tell me about ChatGPT? And he, very excited, said, everyone's saying it's the biggest leap in technology since the internet came in. And to me, that was like, okay, right, I understand that now. I get how huge this is. And I've seen it watching the software developers in the 18 months. They've gone from, this tech didn't really exist to, rather than writing all the code, they're now, of course, they still know how to write code and they're writing some of the code, but a lot of their job is blended with AI so that they are prompting the code. So the way they're engaging with it is they're asking questions, but they're getting the code, they're getting the ChatGPT to write the code, whereas before they had to do the manual labor of the code. So same sort of thing for lawyers. Before we would manually have to do all that searching through all the databases to get the answers. Now we would just ask the AI the questions and the answers are going to come through. But you still need a level of training to understand when the AI is hallucinating when giving you the wrong answer. And you also need some level of knowledge to know what are the questions to ask, so that you can get intelligent, useful answers. So I think it's pretty obvious that junior stuff is going to be done by AI more effectively. And the question, I guess, is how much time then do you spend junior in your career still doing that foundational work, because you'll need to have some level of knowledge and what that is to build on practice later. But then you think, okay, so then what does become our job? What should we be doing? And there's so many great things we can be doing. My context largely is in-house, so I talk about it from that perspective. But you think in-house lawyers, by and large, incredibly intelligent, well-trained, of course, generally sort of well-trained, generally well-regarded. If they've done the job right, getting good trust across the business. So then there's this role that you can play in helping businesses navigate complexity. And I think the thing we're seeing now, ESG is this much bigger issue across businesses. We've still got the ethical considerations around, can we do this, but should we be doing this? Lawyers can play a real role in this, but I think we've got to, certainly the way in which we train our lawyers around what we think it is to think like a lawyer, and then also our own mindsets around what is our purpose as lawyers. That does need to shift a bit, because technology is going to do all that basic stuff.
Is it that much of a shift though? Because when I think about, when I go back to where you started and you started to describe the role, and particularly when you've been most effective in-house, I didn't hear you talking about doing a lot of the stuff that we're now talking about, which is the stuff that might be replaced by it. So it's almost like that pulls you out of the real work, right? Once you've reached that point, the real work is relational, the real work is influence, the real work. So a lot of the stuff you're talking about, if that's the aspiration or that's the career journey leads to that point,
how can you get there quicker?
Isn't the work we're describing, like the coders, right? The coders now, what does it enable them to do? Where is their focus?
It's interesting though, those guys, because they're one of the tech teams, sometimes I'm in an office and they're just out the front of me. And when I watch them work, the way they collaborate, it's very different from how I've seen lawyers collaborate. like tech, they always talk about agile and scrum and all of that stuff. But, when you see them come together, the way in which they're operating, I don't know how much this has changed because of how their role has changed, but certainly they're very good at coming together, problem solving collaboratively, sort of iterating and changing quite quickly to solve a problem. Again,
well, if we continue to think of them as an analog, it's just occurred to me that they could be quite a good analog if we think that our young lawyers are coders. If what you're saying is right, that a lot of this work will disappear, then presumably these teams have become a lot smaller. They're not recruiting as many people because they don't need them. Now, I get the sense that's not actually the case. What they've done is they've become technology enabled, right? They've adopted the enablement, and they can produce things more quickly. They can do things that are better.
Yeah.
Because they're paying attention to other things like.
And they're right. They're a lot more.
Even they've become.
Yes, their focus is more on the user experience. So then they're thinking about, they're still creating the same kind of software, but they've got a capacity to think about different elements of it in a different way and maybe ahead of schedule because they're not doing a lot of the other base stuff. The base stuff is quicker.
Yeah. But have they got smaller? Have the teams got smaller?
No, this team is not. Well, it's growing, but no, the team has not gotten smaller as a result of this. But the capability of what they're able to do, I think, has shifted.
And are they at the point now where they're recruiting for different capabilities, or is it still?
They will. That's probably more about the function of the growth of the business as opposed to.
So I just want to invite you to challenge or to sit with one of the assumptions that I think underpins what you were saying about development. I hear this a lot. There's still a value in doing this sort of what we describe as low value work because of its developmental opportunity. Is there? Provocative question. Right?
Yeah.
That's how we learn.
I know, and I was about to say it's very hard to separate from your own experience. So although I was talking about all the the things that I found energizing in my roles and the leadership that influence those things, I still spent a lot of time on the tools, writing documents or negotiating contracts, those sorts of things. My current view on this is I think it's very hard to know what questions to ask if you don't know what what a good foundation looks like. How much time do they need to spend drafting iterations of contracts and those sorts of things? I don't know.
And presumably this oversight, while we're in this phase where it's somewhat unreliable, it's got to be quality tested. You need expertise to do that.
Yeah, I think that is going to evolve very, very, very rapidly because you just look at in the last 18 months how much that technology has come, and that's from just being trained on general information when it's trained much better on much more bespoke legal information. The quality of what it produces is going to be much better, of course.
And you're also describing, I think, there's a big emphasis at the moment on prompting, on our ability to instruct appropriately to get a better outcome. It seems to me that in the context of if we're going to use it to generate legal advice, essentially, prompting becomes technical. It's more technical. There's a technical input to that.
Yeah.
Which we're going to need for a while, but ultimately we get to a point where we can insert the human problem we're trying to solve or the complex problem we're trying to solve, and it will do that as well. Because I think there's a big emphasis at the moment on, in terms of what's the developmental challenge here for us as a profession. It's still in the interface with technology. It's still about getting to the point where we're truly using enabling technology. But then what becomes the core of our education? What becomes the core of our development? Where is our focus?
And this is Legal Human is this podcast, right? This is this very human. It is a human supply chain. It's these human skills there's lots of our jobs that are going to change because technology will do it better, but it's ultimately this human interaction, this solving problems in a relational context, selling comfort, like actually having people feel comfortable, particularly with the increasing rate of ambiguity and complexity and volatility that we're experiencing. So what are those skills that and I think this is a big challenge for all of us, but certainly for lawyers, is that getting comfortable with the ambiguity and the not knowing.
And it brings us back to where we started, and I'm going to finish in a moment, but it brings us back to where we started, right, which is if your identity to some extent is defined by being a lawyer, and that is largely around expertise.
Yeah, very much expertise.
And also other people on this podcast have talked about the status that comes from being perceived to be an expert, right? So do you just become another person who's just talking generally about human systems change? Where do you drive your status to be able to, from time to time, advocate from a position of expertise? It's not that we never have to do that. Sometimes you are walking into a situation where you just have to say, guys, this is a bad idea. You're going to go to jail.
Yeah.
Now, they have to believe that you know that at that moment. I don't know if there's an answer to this. Maybe embedded technology. We haven't talked about that, but if this ends up being synthesized, it's part of us, our decision making.
What do you mean, embedded technology?
It's an embedded device.
Oh, you're far more sci-fi than my brain goes. Yeah, it's an interesting question, that whole thing around identity.
Who are we?
Who are we? Yeah.
What is a lawyer? I don't think we can answer that.
Oh, well, I was going to say it's what we make it. But even now, this, say I'm a lawyer, what does it mean? I'm a lawyer. Like I use it, and it's like, it's a bit of a shorthand to, okay, well, they're trained, they're, it's some kind of credentials. Is that any different from someone else saying I'm an accountant or I'm
it's sort of
some other profession?
Uniform. I get on a plane. There is a guy or a lady who comes on with 4 pips on their shoulder, and I feel more comfortable.
Yeah.
Because I assume,
the
process of training put them into that position to be able to do that, and I can't.
Yeah.
For us, though, it's often we don't look any different necessarily to another human being. So it's in the expression of that expertise we derive our, other than in court where there's all the pageantry and uniforms and the artifacts that give trust to the system.
Yeah.
So we rely heavily on sort of brand trust.
Yeah.
If you're in that firm, therefore you must be know your stuff.
Yeah, it's a shorthand too.
Any final thoughts?
I think like anyone who says the future of law is X we just don't know. I mean, I really think we have to be comfortable in that not knowing, but also be confident that there is still very much a place for lawyers. What legal practice looks like is absolutely going to shift, of course, but I think there's still always a role for humans interacting with other humans on complex problems and solving issues. And also upholding the rule of law. Like that, fundamentally, that's what we're here to do. And I think that role is also increasingly, that's an important one. When we're, particularly now, we're talking about, we're seeing threats to democracy, organisations doing all kinds of misconduct. There's a huge role for that just in governance. What that looks like in terms of practice, who knows? But I think the actual role of lawyers, there's a real, there'll always be a critical role.
And as you know, that's why I love working, particularly with the in-house profession, because every day I meet professionals who take their superordinate responsibility really seriously. It's not tokenism. It's not something they say. It's something that they feel deeply is
as a duty.
And that's a really attractive thing to be around, that sense of purpose beyond just doing stuff.
Mm.
You've also answered the last question, which is, what's your level of optimism about the emerging role of human lawyers in the legal ecosystem and society?
I mean, imagine a world where you didn't have to do all of the grunt work rubbish. Like, how phenomenal would our practice be then? So, I mean, there is that role for technology there. We're really good, though, at busy work. That's that whole... It's hard to step away from the drafting the document or from inadvertently proofreading marketing's copy because they don't have their own people to do it, or, those things that lawyers end up always doing. It's hard to step away from that. But, imagine if our time could be spent doing those bigger things, how great that would be for the businesses we're in, for society broadly, and then for ourselves as a practice and sense of achievement. It'd be phenomenal.
Well, I look forward to realising that with you. Kirsty, thank you so much for joining Legal Human.
My pleasure, Anthony. Thanks.
You've been listening to Legal Human. To hear more Legal Human podcasts, subscribe to the channel.
For more insights from Lander and Rogers, visit our website at landers.com.au or connect with us on LinkedIn, Instagram and YouTube.